So we're continuing our discussion of Chapter 9, Speech, Sound Disorders in Children, continuing our defining of words related to phonemes and phoneme production. So the acronym IPA, it's not always a beer, International Phonetic Alphabet. This is the print system that's used to represent all of the sounds of any given language. It provides a written symbol for each sound as well as a descriptor. So those descriptors are words like bilabial, fricative, labiodental, and so on. We'll discuss those in a bit. These terms describe the articulatory features of a sound. They let us know what the articulators are doing when a sound is produced. So at its simplest, each sound is classified as either a consonant or a vowel. And the primary difference between the two is the constriction in the oral cavity as the sound is made. So vowel sounds have little or no constriction within the oral cavity, whereas consonants have a higher degree of constriction. The exception for that are consonants like the H consonant. There's very little constriction for that, but it is still a consonant because the sound, the constriction is made at the level of the larynx. So let's talk about consonants here. Consonants are described by three key articulatory features. The first of those is place. So place of articulation, where within the oral cavity or oral tract is that point of constriction. So for example, these are when we use the terms like bilabial, two lips, labiodental, lips on the teeth. So this sounds like f and v. Linguodental, so tongue and teeth, so the th sounds, for example. Alveolar, remember your alveolar ridge is that little bumpy ridge just behind your top front teeth. So alveolar sounds like t, d, where your tongue is pressed up against there. Palatal sounds, sounds made with along the palate, or velar sounds, the velum toward the very back of the mouth. And then glottal sounds. We don't have a lot of glottal sounds in English, but we do have some. For example, I'm going to spell a word here for you for a minute so then you can say it how you would say it and then hear it how I would say it. So the word button. How do you say that word? My daughter-in-law says button. I say button, button. I press my tongue up against the palate, and then I use a glottal stop, a glottal plosive, or we'll explain plosive in a minute, but I use my glottis, so the vocal cords, in order to make that sound. So button, or the word whatever. Now, if I really want to emphasize it, I might say whatever, right? But most of the time we say whatever. That is a glottal sound, whatever. So those are place of articulation. Manner of articulation is how the airflow is manipulated by the articulators. So these are the terms stop, nasal, fricative, affricate, liquid, glide. So a stop sound, the airflow is completely stopped before it's then started again. So these are sounds like p, b, right? T, d, k, g. Airflow is stopped and then it's started again. A nasal sound, these are the n, like n, and the ng sound, ring. Fricative sounds. Fricative sounds have some constriction along the vocal tract. So s, f, sh, zh. There are other fricative sounds as well, but there's some constriction of the air along the vocal tract. Affricate sounds, Affricate, affricate. This is where the air is stopped, but then it's released as a continuous flow. So these are sounds like ch and j. Okay, the difference between those and a stop sound is the stop sound, the sound just explodes out. We call it a plosive. It explodes out, not a continuous flow. So the difference between p and ch, where there's a stop and then a continuous flow. A liquid sound. The tongue is held tight at the midline with air going around it. So we, in American English, we have the l and the sounds. These are liquid sounds. Other languages have different liquid sounds. For example, my heritage is Welsh. I don't speak Welsh, but they have a sound that we don't have in our language. And it's basically, how do I explain it? It's a lateral production on both sides, a lateral sound. So, for example, in the word, I'm going to spell it again for you because it's not an uncommon last name. Llewellyn. If we were using English pronunciation, we would say Llewellyn. They don't say it that way. It's Llewellyn. Llewellyn. The sound's coming. There's a fricative sound coming alongside a liquid. So it's a combining of a fricative and a liquid. And then we have glide sounds in English. These are the most open of the consonant sounds. So sounds like w and ya. These are glides. Glides can only occur in the beginning or middle word position. Remember, we're not talking about letters or spelling because obviously Y happens at the end of words, but the y consonant sound can only happen at the beginning or in the middle of a word. The third way we describe consonant sounds is by voicing. And this is just simply whether our voice is used or not. So this is the difference between p and b. Everything else is exactly the same. The places are the same, the manner is the same, but the voicing is different. I turn my voice on for b as opposed to p. There's no voicing for that sound. And we have a few of those cognate pairs. The s, z, the p, b, f, v, and there's a couple more. So I also want to tell you in the book, well, first of all, let me back up. Phonemes. A phoneme, when we're writing a phoneme sound, you will always see it between two, I'm going to do it this way, two slashed lines. I don't know which way you're seeing this, but two slashed lines. So if you see the S phoneme, the S phoneme, and we're talking about a phoneme, it will always be written between slashed lines. Now, sometimes in the book, you will see a list of phonetic symbols or list of phonemes between brackets, and that is because it's a list. So if we're going to list them, we put them between brackets, but if we're just talking about an individual phoneme, it's between two slashed lines. If we are writing a letter, if I just want to say letter S, but I don't want to use the word letter, I would put it in quotation marks, and that tells me I'm just talking about the grapheme, not necessarily the phoneme. So vowels, we already talked about consonants. Vowels we can also describe, and they are described by 4 different features. The first one is tongue height. So how high within the oral cavity the tongue is placed for production. So this is where I'm expecting you sitting here on watching the video to be saying all of these things out loud so you can feel what I'm talking about. So tongue height, we go from high to mid to low. Tongue height, E, oo, ah. You feel your tongue very high and tight, and we'll get to that one in a minute, but it's very high within the oral cavity for E, and then it's in the mid section of the oral cavity for oo, and then very low for ah, the tongue height. The second descriptor is advancement. This is how far forward the tongue is within the oral cavity for production. So again, we're going to go from front to central to back, from E to to Feel your tongue move. E, Your tongue goes from front to back on that sound, those sounds. The third descriptor is roundness, how round the lips are on production of the sound. So from very rounded to what we call vowel neutral, and then unrounded. So oo to to e. You can see what my lips are doing here. Ooh, e. Roundness. So from rounded to vowel neutral to unrounded. And then the fourth descriptor is tension. So tension in the vowels is referring to how tense or how relaxed the muscles of articulation are. We're going to use the word lax instead of relaxed. So for example, E compared to I. They're produced in every other way, in the same place in your mouth and with the same level of roundness, for example, but your tongue muscles are much more tense for E than they are for I. Okay, we're going to move on to acquisition of consonant sounds. And I think I've moved my notes to the other side over here. I didn't realize that from the last time I was recording. So it's going to look a little funny. Acquisition of consonant sounds. Consonants are acquired in English in a fairly predictable pattern of acquisition. And we talked about this in the chapter on development. I'm going to shift some things here a little bit. In your book on page 281, there is a table with the list of typical age of acquisition, and this one's divided up in a little more broad categories than we looked at back in the previous chapter that discussed this. So I want to explain before we look at that, though, the difference between the words delay and disorder. A child with a delay in development will acquire sounds basically in the same order as a typically developing child, just in a delayed fashion. They'll acquire them at a later age. Whereas a child with disorder, the order of acquisition of those sounds may not stay the same. They may acquire late developing sounds before they've mastered some of the earlier developing sounds. So back to table 9.3 in our text. The early 8 sounds, these are the sounds that we expect children to have acquired with some degree of success by age 3. And you can see that they're what we would consider the kind of easier sounds to produce. They're not complicated at all. So the b, the y sound, n, w, d, p, and h. These are the sounds that you think of hearing toddlers use all the time. The middle 8 sounds are then picked up along with those early 8 by age 4, and we expect some level of mastery of those sounds. So these are the t, the ng sound, like at the end of the word ring, the k and g, the f and v, the ch, and the j sound. And I'm going to use letters here, even though I should be producing sounds. I just think it's easier for you to hear that over video than it is if I'm standing in front of you live producing them. And then the late 8 sounds. These are the 8 that we expect to now finish out acquisition of sounds by age 6.5. So these are the sh sounds, the s and the z, the 2 versions of the th sound, the r, the l, and the zh sound, as in the word beige. And we expect, as I said, by age 6.5 that children will have relative mastery of those sounds. So when I get a referral from a teacher or a parent, I don't just look at these charts of order of acquisition and age of acquisition. I have to take a couple more things into consideration. So for example, if I get a referral for a 5-year-old child and they're missing 4 or 5 of those late 8 developing sounds, if I'm only looking at the chart of acquisition and the age of acquisition, then I would say, well, I'm not even going to test this child because I know they're not 6.5 yet. They may well acquire these sounds just with normal development. But I'm still going to go ahead and test the child, because if they're missing that many of the late 8 sounds, chances are it is interfering with how well they can make themselves understood. And so intelligibility then may be the issue I address in therapy, as opposed to absolutely correcting production for every single one of those sounds. I would want to look at what's impacting their ability to make themselves understood, and address that. Hope that makes sense. So now I'm going to give you a little soapbox on phonology and literacy. In your textbook, there used to be, in previous editions, there were always sections called the Spotlight on Literacy. And they were terrific information. And I understand why they have to edit things out when they're redoing a textbook, but there are some important terms in there that I want you to know. So from my own experience, there is a high degree of correlation between phonological disorders and literacy achievement. And so these are just some terms that I want you to know. Again, many of them are either not in your text, or they're not highlighted in your text in those sections because they've taken them out. So the first one is the term alphabetic code. If you remember, when we talked about the definition of language, we said that it's a code, an arbitrary code that's shared by a group of speakers. Well, the alphabetic code is the written form of that code. We use alphabet letters to combine to make words. Those words then represent some specific concept or thing. And so when children are learning to read, they are learning to break the alphabetic code. Some other terms, phoneme, grapheme, correspondence. Now, grapheme is the more specific term for written letters. So phoneme, grapheme, correspondence is how that sound relates to the written letter. Okay, now phoneme, grapheme, correspondence can also be said sound symbol correspondence, which is the way you probably hear it if you work in a public elementary school. Sound symbol correspondence. So when we learn sound symbol or phoneme, grapheme correspondence, we are working toward learning to break that alphabetic code. The system that we use to do that is called phonics. Probably most of you in this room learn to read and to spell using a system of phonics, learning that sound symbol correspondence so that you could then break or unlock the alphabetic code. And then the term phonological awareness. We've already discussed this term a few times. It's that greater understanding of how speech, now not written word, but speech can be broken down into smaller units. Phonological awareness is important to having those beginning literacy skills. So we're going to move on to classification of speech sound disorders. And in your book on page 284, you'll see a chart. And we're going to discuss that, many pieces of it, but not all of it. In a second, I'll get more specific with it. But what it shows you is two different classification frames. The first one, or two ways we can classify speech sound disorders. The first one is an etiological classification. Etiological always means cause, or etiology means cause. So when we're talking about classifying in that way, we're talking about looking at what is the cause of this disorder, and that's how we're going to classify it. The second one is called the linguistic profile, and this is classification based on psycholinguistic areas of breakdown. This one is more theoretically based, and it's less identifiable by cause, put it that way. Now, these classification systems have use. They are useful, but they're probably not always the best way to cleanly classify groups of kids that we see. They're useful with school-age kids, but not as much with younger kids. And as I said, they're not always a perfectly clean classification. So in your book, down on the bottom of 283, the page before, in the second paragraph from the bottom, beginning with the word Bowen, she describes classification of just two groups. So the first group is preschoolers who have a high number of errors in their speech. So they have a low intelligibility. So they're missing a lot of sounds, and they're difficult to understand. So they have fewer consonants available to them that they can use correctly. Okay. Then the second group is now school-age children. These children tend to have high intelligibility in their speech. You can understand them. They have many consonants that they produce correctly available to them, and they just have a few remnant errors. And that is the biggest two classifications of kids with speech sound disorders. So moving on to some of those groups on the chart on page 284. As I said, I will never ask you to replicate a chart or a graph for me, but the information in there is good. Now we're going to go through a few of those things, and I'm going to give you additional information that is not in the chart and that's not in the book, that's describing some of those things so you can have a better understanding of what they are. The first one we're going to look at is speech sound disorders of unknown origin. The book calls it speech delay genetic. And the reason there's a discrepancy here is because, as with many things that we'll talk about this semester, where we can't pin down an actual physical cause or psychological cause, we also see there's runs in families. So there is more than likely some genetic tie-in with this speech sound disorder. This is about 60% of kids that are presenting with speech sound disorders, a high percentage of our kids. It's also sometimes called a functional phonological disorder. We know that there will be more boys than girls identified with this, or they do present with it, and that about 4% of kids, 4% of preschool age or kindergarten age kids will present with this kind of disorder. Some of the defining characteristics: these kids tend to have a small phonetic inventory. So this was that first group back that Bowen described. They have a small number of consonants that are available for them to use correctly. Excuse me. Because of that, one of the other things that is not uncommon is they present with something called phoneme collapse, where they have one very strong consonant and they use that in place of many other consonants. So let's say the child has good production of the t phoneme, but they say t when they want to say s or z or f or v or n. So they collapse all of those phonemes down into just that one phoneme that they have good use of. These errors also tend to have some target-substitute relationship. So, for example, a child who substitutes the n phoneme for l phoneme, there's a target-substitute relationship. The target being the sound they want to say, l, and the substitute being what they're putting in place of it, n. The relationship there is place of articulation. You can see it as you're watching the video. My tongue is going to exactly the same place for n as it is for l. So there's the relationship. And then they also tend to have greater, that's a funny way to say that, never mind. They tend to have much reduced intelligibility. Remember, intelligibility is how well a person can make themselves understood to an unfamiliar listener, someone not familiar with their typical pattern of speech. And these kids tend to have significantly reduced intelligibility. About 30% of kids who present with this speech delay that's genetic or has unknown cause also have some significant comorbid language impairment that comes along for the ride with that. Now, comorbid is a medical term that means two disorders pregnant. Wow, that was a misspeech. Two disorders present at the same time. Two distinct disorders. One is not causing the other disorder. So, for example, just to pull something out of medicine, someone with a heart condition may also have a hearing loss. They're comorbid. Doesn't mean one caused the other. There's no causal relationship. So a child with ADHD may also have chronic middle ear infections, or a child with autism may also have cerebral palsy. Those are comorbid conditions. One does not cause the other. So, causes and risk factors for, or mostly we're going to talk about risk factors now for these speech delays with unknown cause or of genetic origin. We know that these kids are at significant risk for things like dyslexia because we do studies that look at those percentages. They tend to have some general weakness in language development overall, not all of them, but some of them. And then again, it tends to run in families. So the next one that we're going to talk about is speech delay, developmental apraxia of speech. Now, we're not going to talk about this very much because we will talk about it much more in our next chapter. It is not an impairment of the phonological system, but it is some impairment in the motor or muscular processing system. So the relaying of motor information to the muscles of the articulators. Of our kids that present with speech errors in general, this is a very small percentage, about 3 to 5%. And it is an impairment in that planning and sequencing of motor movement needed for accurate speech sound production. As I said, we're not going to talk about it any more than that right now because we'll get to that next week in the chapter on motor speech disorders. The third one in the chart here that I want to talk about is that speech delay caused by otitis media with effusion. Otitis media is the medical term for middle ear infection, and effusion just means there's a buildup of gunk, for lack of the medical term, but a kind of thick, viscous fluid in the middle ear associated with that infection. And this is for kids where this is a chronic situation, which we'll talk about that in just a minute. But they have the same description of their errors as I mentioned for our first one. So that small inventory of sounds available, phoneme collapse, target substitute relationship, reduced intelligibility. These errors of speech production are probably the result of auditory deprivation. And what that means is that this child has had such significant and recurring middle ear infections where their hearing is reduced that they literally have not had significant enough auditory input for them to develop production of the sound correctly. And these chronic middle ear infections have to be happening at the time that they should be acquiring sound production. Some specific markers for this or significant red flags that a child is going to present with speech delay as they're developing through this period. Things like delayed onset of babbling. They don't do that at the age we expect. So again, then also delayed onset of the use of meaningful speech. They don't say their first words at right around a year. It may take a little longer. They have even reduced intelligibility compared with those children with other phonological disorders. And they have problems with very specific class of sounds. Because the middle ear is full of this fluid, the sounds that aren't getting through are most likely going to be the high frequency sounds. So the SHs, the THs, the F, the Z, or F and V sounds. So those are the specific sounds they may have errors with. They may also use some sounds that are not necessarily represented in the phonetic inventory of their native language, not because they are learning some other language, but because they're just producing a distortion of a sound that occurs in their language. It's how they hear the sound and not the way it's supposed to be made. So these are kids that generally have 6 or more episodes of otitis media with effusion in the first 3 years of life. So that period when they're developing those phonological representations of sounds, those cognitive representations, These kids are also tend to be the ones, well, first let me back up by saying not all kids that have chronic otitis media with effusion develop speech sound disorders. Most of them, in fact, go on to develop speech in a very typical fashion. But those that do also have that speech disorder that follows the chronic otitis media, They tend to be kids that are not very resilient physically in any case. They don't recover quickly from being sick. They get sick again quickly following one episode following another. We know that it occurs more in children of poverty. That's probably because of lack of maybe sanitary conditions and or limitations with their health care. We also know that there may be also a genetic predisposition for language disorders for these kids who are also not resilient and living in poverty. There's also a predisposition for other health issues, again, because of this not bouncing back easily, not being resilient. Okay, we're going to stop this one right here, and we will see you for a third video, I believe. Look for that on titanium. I have to go over the rest of the notes and see if I can squeak out one more video or if we can do it all in class.